The Jerry Sandusky trial has brought the topic of sexual abuse of kids to the forefront of the nation's attention, and everyone's been talking about his guilt or innocence. But do you know how to talk to your children or grandchildren about it? Would you know the warning signs of possible abuse in your child? And would you believe them if they accused a trusted friend or family member? Well, we have one of the country's leading authorities on child sex abuse here with us this hour to tell us what every parent needs to know about this very disturbing topic. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lynn Doyle. This may be one of the most important and frank discussions that we have ever had here on It's Your Call. This hour we're going to talk about the sexual abuse of children and the very specific and graphic details every adult needs to be aware of these days. Here to help us with that is Dr. Janet Rosenzweig. She's been a pioneer in the treatment of child abuse victims, having been an advocate for more than 30 years. She's currently the interim director of Prevent Child Abuse Pennsylvania. She's also written a book that every parent should get. It's called The Sex-Wise Parent, The Parent's Guide to Protecting Your Child, Strengthening Your Family, and Talking to Kids About Sex, Abuse, and Bullying. A very timely subject. Janet, nice to have you back with us.
Thank you. That's good to be here.
This is a conversation that every parent should have, but most of us are not comfortable having it. Why?
Because adults don't like to think of our kids as sexual. You know, it's natural for sex not to want to cross generations. Kids don't want to think of their parents as sexual. Even at our age, we don't want to think of our parents as being sexual. But as parents raising kids, we have to get past that and treat their sexuality and their reproductive anatomy and physiology like we would any part of their body that we want them to keep healthy.
So there are two different kinds of sex education these days. One is the so-called birds and bees talk that you start with kids and you tell them where babies come from, and then as they get older you start to explain to them how their bodies are changing. Mm-hmm. Then there's the so-called predator alert conversation. Both equally difficult?
Both are equally difficult, and either one is not enough. Even the two of them together are not enough. What I hope happens out of all this is families take a good hard look at how they handle all aspects of sexuality within the family. What do we talk about? Love, about intimacy, about touch, and we build on the fact that sexuality is the culmination of all of that wonderful stuff. Because when we have our first talks with our kids about sex and it's about predators, that's leaving an impression that may not be the healthiest or the best impression we want to leave.
See, here's where it's so challenging for parents today, because you want to protect your child and you want to give them, as much information as you can. But at the same time, you don't want them to be completely afraid of sex or to think that sex is a horrible thing, because as we all know, given in the right circumstances and with the right person at the right age, it's part of life. So at what age do we start to have just a conversation about sex and sexual body parts?
We should be having the conversations with our kids from the time they're old enough to talk. From the time we're bathing our babies and we're saying to our babies, I'm going to wash your knees, I'm going to wash your thighs, I'm going to wash your belly, I'm going to wash your penis. We have to treat the reproductive anatomy in the same exact matter-of-fact way that we treat any part of the anatomy. Now, if we didn't do that when our kids were little, it's not too late to start.
Okay, so you say that there are some approaches that should be implemented by parents. Be thoughtful and careful when talking about sex. What do you mean by that?
Kids, if you use a word that you think your kid understands and they don't, they're going to put a different meaning on the word. So we have to be very careful that we're using words our kids understand. And when we finish our sentence, we say, did you understand what mommy meant? Can you tell me what you think you heard? And make sure they got the point.
Now, you mentioned earlier about washing body parts, and you used penis. Do you suggest that parents use the proper medical name for body parts as opposed to, the little baby names that we tend to use?
My standard is that your child have language that other people will understand. I think pretty much that if a little boy says my wee-wee, people know what he means. It would be nice if the kid said penis, but what's very difficult is so many families have these unusual slang for the female genitals. We had one case that a pediatrician shared with me. The little girl said to a teacher, "Daddy hurt my cookie." So the teacher gave her a cookie. Cookie was slang in her family for genitalia, so the kid's getting a snack when she needs a report to child protection. So particularly with girls, we don't seem to have a common slang for genitalia, so teaching the girls to use the word vagina is or gina without the, you know, or the JJ is a common word these days. Kids they need to be understood.
Okay, another one of your approaches is to use Pavlov's instructions.
Yes, yes. Well, it's those of us that remember elementary psychology from back in our college days probably learned about Pavlov and his dogs in classical conditioning. And the lesson from Pavlov is, with he was trying to train dogs to run a maze, and if they got to the end, a bell rang and they got food. Well, it got to the point in his experiments where the dog started salivating just at the sound of the bell. So even if there wasn't food, the bell meant something good was happening. So they learned to put those things together. The point here is, what emotions are our kids going to be putting together with sex? So if every time the kid hears something about sex, it's tied up with fear and guilt and shame, they're going to grow up associating sex with fear, guilt, and shame. So we want our kids to associate sex and sexuality with love and happiness and health and self-worth.
Okay, good lesson for parents. If you have questions or comments, we're going to give you the opportunity to email us. I'm at lynn@lynndoyle.net. You also say that you suggest parents should provide tools to alleviate fear. Yes. And to get rid of ignorance. I mean, yes. That's, I would assume, more for older children or preteen kids? My hope would be that by the time a child gets close to adolescence, they've got all of the information about anatomy and physiology. There's a period in our kids' development that developmental psychologists call the golden age of childhood, like that period somewhere between like 6 and 11, where our parents are still the smartest people in the universe. We still want to listen to them. That's those points there where we fill the kids with our value system, right? With all of the knowledge we think they need to be able to be sexually safe and healthy. And so by the time they come into adolescence, they're not going to be scared that a period means they're bleeding to death or that their penis is getting hard by itself because it's not working correctly. That's the kind of knowledge kids need. Okay, so now that we transition into how do we warn our children, and at what age do we start warning them? Educating them is one thing, but protecting them now goes hand in hand with that. So at what age should we start to say to children, you have private areas that no one should see or no one should touch unless it's mommy, daddy, or the doctor?
That's a great question. What built into your statement there is a need for parents to help kids understand the difference between privacy and secrecy. We all have the right to privacy, and the older we get, the more of it we're going to want with the kids. Secrecy is a whole different story. So, and a great example to use with that is the bathroom. Right? What you're doing in the bathroom is not a secret. I'm your mommy and I need to know if your poo is the wrong color or your pee hurts or whatever. But I don't need to watch you. So that's private, right? But it's not secret. So as we can make those points to our kids, then we can be moving in the direction with the kids so that certain kind of touch, there should never be secret between kids and parents. Privacy maybe, but not the secrets.
I think that's a wonderful piece of advice to suggest that kids understand about privacy and that they're entitled to that even as little ones.
Yes.
My grandsons will say, I need some privacy,
yes.
You know. But then the secrecy is like, I hadn't thought of it in those terms.
Yes.
So I think that's a very helpful piece of information there. When a child is being groomed, or if someone is looking for a possible victim, is there anything that we can do to make sure our kid is not that person, is not the victim that a pedophile would seek out?
The one guarantee is having your kid hit puberty. I mean, that was a running joke in my household, which we were very frank, is that my son was not spending the night without one of his parents chaperoning until he hit puberty and like aged out of being, attractive to a pedophile. With the serious side of that is we really have to know every adult that's spending one-on-one time with our kids. We really, really have to know. We can take nothing for granted. The babysitter, right? We come home, what did you do? What games did you play? we just really, really, really have to know every adult that has access to our kid.
That is so frightening to parents and grandparents, just to think, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, I trust my child with a teacher or with a coach or with a babysitter, and then you hear about it every day that those people and everyone else in every, you know, in every profession and known to man has abused a child or has, you know, put a child in jeopardy or danger, and it's just frightening because you're like, who can you trust?
You can trust yourself, and you can trust your judgment, and you can trust yourself to really be aware of all of the adults and older teens, because little kids are sometimes at risk from older teens. Anyone that's alone with your child, just check in with your kid afterwards. Don't make them paranoid, but, you know, what did you do? What games did you play? Was it fun? How did you feel? And if your kid comes home, or, you know, you come home and someone's in the house and your kid doesn't seem quite right, talk about it. It may be simply that he lost the game of Monopoly and feels bad about it, or it might be that the babysitter suggested a game that gave him the creeps.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because I was telling people that we were doing this show, people with small children, and all of us said the same thing. If something doesn't feel right, whether you're 5 years old, whether you're 50 years old, you shouldn't do it. Like, if you stay away from those people that just give you the creeps.
If we learn to trust our social intelligence, if we learn to trust our instincts, and trust our instincts, even when all the messages in the society are saying, you know, this guy is okay.
Should be okay.
Trust your own instincts.
Okay, I'm going to take a short break, but you know what, when we come back, we're going to go over those signs, what parents should look for in case you suspect abuse. We'll do that when we come back. Right now, though, we're inviting you to join in our conversation with your questions and your comments for Dr. Rosenzweig. Are there things that you'd like to ask, but maybe you're a little bit uncomfortable doing so in person? You can email those questions to us. If you want advice on how to speak to a child about protecting themselves from predators, email us that. Or if you know someone that you fear might be being abused, or someone who you think could be an abuser and you need help confronting all of that, we're here to answer those questions. Email me at lynn@lynndoyle.net. As always, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We're going to be back with more, a very important conversation. Stay with us. What parents need to know about sex and potential sex abuse of your child. That's the topic here on It's Your Call this hour. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I'm Lynn Doyle. We are joined by child sex expert Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, who's here to answer some of the most difficult questions that parents have about talking to their kids about sex, sexual abuse, and molestation. One thing that parents need to know is warning signs. You need to write this information down or look us up again on YouTube and keep track of this. Janet, these are some of the things that indicate your child could be the victim of a predator. Unexplained nightmares, wetting the bed, new words for private parts, hesitates removing clothes before bed or bath, ask other children to play sexual games, and mimics adult-like sexual behaviors. If one of these things happen, what should a parent do?
Well, even if all of those things are happening, it's no guarantee your child's a victim. Every one of these things that we've just gone through could be the sign that your kid is going through a phase, or you left your computer onto a website he shouldn't have seen. But if you really think, you know, you're suspicious, the first thing you need to do is think back to who are all the adults your kid has been around. Has your child been with a new situation? Has there been a new babysitter? Is someone in your family have a new adult partner? Just sort of asking yourself, is there something new or somebody in the house? The one thing that parents shouldn't do is start asking kids questions. I have a whole chapter in this book about how parents need to learn how to speak to their kids. If people recall the McMartin case, the hysteria that came, what happened with the McMartin case is one family thought that their kid had been abused, went to the police, and the police sent letters home to all the parents and said, ask your kid if they've been abused, which is, now we know, it's like telling the parents to go do the kid's annual physical. So what we've learned is that kids hear questions, perceive questions, and answer questions very specifically.
So we should not, you were saying, I just want to make sure I get this right, we should not right off the bat say to the kid, is something happening, or did someone touch you inappropriately?
That's absolutely not the right thing to say. Okay. Correct.
So you look back, you see who the child has been around. If if something starts to feel a little hinky to you, what's the next step? When do you talk to the child?
I would really recommend that if you're really concerned, you talk to someone who's a trained child interviewer and get some specific advice on how to phrase questions to kids at different ages. Even a kid by like 8 or 9 that sounds like they've got a full vocabulary and full grasp of the language really aren't hearing things and don't comprehend language and questions the same way that adults do. Gentle, careful, clear observation, watching your kids' behaviors. Now, if you see signs, for example, like blood on the genitalia, there's never a reason for that. I mean, that's a sign to find a pediatrician, preferably one trained, as a child abuse specialist, and there's several, around the area. Then the child needs to go right and have an examination. But behavioral signs, you've got to be careful.
And if you say to your child, if someone touches you, in your private area, you should always come and tell me, one of your parents. Let's say the child actually follows through on that. I can't imagine how difficult that would be for a young child to do, but let's say they do it. How do we respond to that?
Thank you for telling me. Let's talk a little bit about that, right? You stay calm, you resist the urge to want to...
That seems a lot easier said than done.
Well, because one of the things that I recommend in my book, and I really hope parents do this, is you practice this stuff, you role play. If you're, if a book club picks this book up, that parents, if we practice having these conversations with each other, then when the words come, if words come out of your child's mouth, we're not going to react so strongly.
Now, I know that we're focusing a lot on young children, pre-adolescent, because we've heard so much, or I should say preteen, with the Sandusky case and all of the allegations that were made. They were young boys
at the time,
for the most part. But let's talk a little bit about the older child, just very briefly. Some warning signs that parents should look for. Is there anything specific if we have a preteen or a teen, an adolescent that we think could be in an uncomfortable situation?
The key thing with the older kids, where we're not so much worried about pedophiles, with older kids, we're really worried about adults that are predators. And there's plenty of adults that aren't predators, because by definition, an older kid is not a child. It could be folks in school. The classic example that I like to talk about is everyone hears the name Monica Lewinsky, and we all think of her sexual escapades in the White House. No one stops and thinks that she was a sex abuse victim, that she learned to trade sex for power from a high school teacher. So with older kids, even things that look socially acceptable in some cases, everyone knew about this guy and the young women in the school. We've got to be very sensitive to the sexual climate of the places where our children are.
Okay, so some signs that are mentioned by the Child Sex Abuse Prevention and Protection Center say if the kids seem unusually distracted or distant, all of a sudden start refusing to take care of their body, their hygiene, a dramatic change in eating, either a loss of appetite, refuses to eat, drug or alcohol abuse. All of these things might be indicative of ongoing sexual molestation.
Those symptoms that we're describing there are the kinds of symptoms we see when someone has been forced or pulled into a sexual relationship against their will. And the other thing we often see with those kinds of cases is we see depression, we see cutting is very common, kind of to alleviate the pain. And we certainly have to be very, very aware of that. With older kids, I'm also worried about the kids that are willingly being led into these inappropriate relationships with the predatory adults in their house. Those kids are going to be all full of themselves because look at me, I got the teacher paying attention.
And we heard the word grooming quite frequently during the Sandusky trial, where experts testified that sexual abuse didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like we hear sometimes young children being abducted, raped, and then killed, conceivably to try to hide the crime.
Sure.
With the kinds of crimes that were charged, Jerry Sandusky was charged with, was like over a long period of time where he wasn't accused, or experts said he didn't think he was hurting the child, that he was loving the child. So how do we look for those grooming signs?
Well, I think the word grooming is dressing up the word for what it really is. It's seduction. It's a long, slow process of a predator identifying a prey. He can dress it up in his own pathologic ways however they want, but what they're doing is they have made a plan and they are gradually bringing this plan to fruition. They fantasize about it, they think about it, they where's it going to be and when's it going to be, and we really, again, there's nothing more important than knowing every adult that's spending alone time with our child.
If there was one thing that we learned from that trial is that kids that came from at-risk home were at risk, and we have to make sure that we try to pay as much attention to them as possible. I do have to take a quick break. We have some of your questions. I promise we're going to answer them very, very quickly. When we come back, we'll be gone 2 minutes. If you need help, please use this information that we're able to provide for you. Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Lynn Doyle, and this is It's Your Call. We are talking about how you can be a sex-wise parent so that you can talk to your kids and tell them what they need to know to protect themselves from sexual predators. We've given you an opportunity to ask some questions to our expert. From Darlene, she says, I find myself very uncomfortable approaching the topic of sex ed, much less telling my son about men coming on to him. I'm afraid I'll either make him too nervous around everyone or make him think that he's not ready. Think of things that he's not ready for. What would you suggest to Darlene?
Well, she doesn't say the age of her son, so we're just going to have to assume. What I say to Darlene is I borrow a line that, a TV writer put in the mouth of a character who had this situation. You say to your kid, I'm uncomfortable too, but we have to have this conversation. We'll both be better parents for it. Your kid may act uncomfortable, but if you put out the accurate information about anatomy and physiology and what you need him to know, let him sit there and fidget and squirm, but better hear it from you than a stranger.
Do you find that women have a hard time talking to boys if there's not a man in the house about
yes, and I raised
potential
a son
sexual
as a single mother,
molesters?
And if we're not talking to our boys about sex, we know that the bad guys out there will be. We just really have to get over our discomfort, find the resources we need. A book like mine can help, or others, and just do it.
And the book is called The Sex Wise Parent, but it also has a website, thesexwiseparent.com.
Yes.
Okay, and
yes.
is it available where people can get it at bookstores?
Yes,
or?
There's signed copies in some stores around the Philadelphia area. It's at bookstores, online. It's easily for people to get.
Okay, you suggested during the break that perhaps people use this as a book club topic, and I think that is a brilliant idea. I'm in a book club. I think we should do that. Everybody should make this as a topic of conversation so that we can speak about it. I'm going to skip this one about calling the police very quickly. Do we just go right to the cops, or do you do some investigation on your own first if you think something's going on?
My first choice would be most communities have what are called child advocacy centers, which have people trained in multidisciplinary, child protection, law enforcement. I would probably start with the child advocacy center in your community and and have a trained interviewer start with your child. And
very, very quickly, one question: should the same-sex parent talk to the child, like men to boys and women to girls, or what if you don't have that luxury?
If you have two parents of both sexes in the family, ideally kids should hear from parents of both genders. But if you're more comfortable with one or the other, my whole thing is families need to come up with their values and do it their way. Okay, great advice. If you need more, get the book, The Sex Wise Parent. Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, great to have you back with us. Thank you so much. If you were unable to get through, please email us at lynn@lynndoyle.net and get help from people if you need it. Thanks so much.